what does equity actually represent? It represents ownership and control. And that's something which all of us are aware of. The economic interest which the founder or a shareholder has in a company, and an element of control as well. A person who controls more than 51% of the company is said to be in control of the company, and you expect him to take decisions in managing the company. Another perspective on what equity means, we would like to put out here is the tangible value of the investability quotient of the company. So a lot of the factors which you saw on the previous slide, especially in early stage startups which don't have as much of a track record, the investor puts a certain tangible value to it, and that is what becomes your valuation, and that's what goes into negotiations for as you raise capital on what stake you sort of cede to the investor. That's the way we sort of see equity. Equity is a very, very valuable currency. It's literally the only currency the founder has in the initial stages of the company. What should you really part with equity for? You can exchange equity for the following things, if you ask me, which is basically capital. That's the most common use case, where you part with stake in your company and raise capital from a set of financial investors. You may part with equity for talent. You may want to attract the best of people who to work with you and help you build out your company. And you may also want to part with your equity to forge certain strategic relationships. So there may be other players in the ecosystem. A partnership might help both and might help you scale well as well. And you might want to entice these players to sort of take a stake in your company so that they are invested in your growth as much as you are. So managing equity becomes very, very important, and managing equity in our mind has maybe two aspects to it. One is your valuation and dilution itself. So this is where I link back to the point on skin in the game, because many times we have seen companies, we have seen founders who have diluted too much in the earlier rounds of the company. And it's also a sort of a business which requires capital. So they come to a stage where they need capital, but their holding and their stake in the company is fairly low. And that becomes a huge sort of breaking point for investors to, or it causes investors to pause as they're sort of evaluating the company. At the same time, it's also required, companies also require capital to grow. And at some point of time, the investors has to, the founder has to push the button in terms of onboarding an investor and, being comfortable with a certain level of dilution so that he can sort of grow his business. So valuation and dilution is something which definitely forms part of your equity management process, if I were to say. But apart from that, the rights which you give out to your investor also has a very large bearing on the equity which you're ceding to a certain investor. So this may not be very apparent because all of us, at some level track valuation, say, okay, this investor is coming in, I'm giving him 20% stake, etc. But some of the typical investor rights may also have a bearing on that stake which you're giving to the investor, especially in certain scenarios, which we'll sort of cover in later slides. So there was a lot of request among all of you for talking about valuation. So that's a fairly, sort of broad topic. We can really spend almost a couple of hours just as a separate session on valuation. But we just thought it's useful we spend maybe 5 minutes here and give you some perspectives. So valuation, especially for early stage companies, it's more of an art rather than a science. As you mature as a company and as you develop more and more of an operating history, it becomes easier to value the company, and it becomes easier to sort of create a financial argument to put a certain value to a company. At early stages, that argument is going to be driven a lot by intangible factors. So while I have a company which has not yet started operations, I need to find some way to sort of value that company. So I have a look at let's say the founding team, the strength of the idea, strength of the business, a lot of the factors which tie in with the investability quotient, which I sort of talked about earlier. Or even in cases of companies which have started business, but I'm looking to raise capital disproportionate to my scale. So I may be doing revenues of 1 crore, but I might be looking to raise capital of 10 crore. Then all of these factors at some level play a role. And there are certain metrics which investors look at, which founders should also be aware of, which drive valuation. The financial metrics are what is most common for later stage company, for let's say mid stage and later stage companies. Typically, it will be a profitability metric. Your EBITDA or your profit after tax is what will drive your valuation. For companies which are not yet profitable, but still have a reasonable degree of scale, where I can put a number to that, sort of evaluation, then it could be a multiple of revenue. But for companies which may not even have very tangible revenues or which are pre-revenue, Then there may be a certain other set of metrics, right? For, let's say, internet companies, for digital companies, it could be the number of users, or it could be the number of impressions, the number of hits your website has. So there are several metrics, operating metrics, I should say, which play a role in determining the valuation of the company. So it's important for founders to understand what investors look for, especially in companies which don't have financial metrics to showcase. What operating metrics can you showcase, and can you ask for a certain valuation? The common methods of valuation, typically are to look at precedent transactions in that field. So you're operating in a certain sector, in a certain subsector. What other deals have happened in that sector and subsector? Either funding transactions or even M&A transactions. Can you look at those multiples, and can you try to make a valuation argument for yourself? So again, like I said, this could be multiples on a financial basis, which could be your sales revenue multiple, or your profitability multiple if you're profitable, or it could be operating metrics as well. Typically, if people remember the early days in e-commerce, all the e-commerce companies were valued as a multiple of their GMV. So it's one way to sort of benchmark yourself against other companies. This becomes very important in early stage companies because while it's very difficult, like I said, it's more of an art. But especially institutional investors, no one is comfortable just saying that, okay, I took a call on the valuation of the company and this is what it is. All these investors have to justify their valuation internally as well to their limited partners and to their investment committee. So they want some signs to sort of come through. So everyone's looking out for some benchmark. So as a company, if you are able to point out to certain other companies and say that, I am either similar or superior to them, they got a certain multiple, I think you should give me the same multiple. That will be the basis of a valuation argument, especially for early stage companies. Trading multiples is something I would say more relevant for later stage companies, which is basically, you look at a listed company, which is in a similar sort of a domain, and look at where they're trading and try to make an argument for yourself. So this again is very similar to precedent transactions, but maybe more suitable for companies with more of an operating history, because this is typically done with financial metrics. It's very rare to see trading multiples on operating metrics. And the third, sort of means of valuation is your discounted cash flow, your DCF. So you make a projection based on where you are as a company over the next maybe 5 years to 7 years to 10 years. And you apply a certain discount factor and take the value of that to the present. So basically, this is, from a corporate finance perspective, to say that, look at my company as a series of cash flows, which will come to you in the future. And I'm going to discount it based on the risk of those cash flows. And I'm going to give you a certain value. And I think you should invest at or around that value. That's the argument you're making to an investor. Again, for early stage companies, it's a little bit uncommon, but, it's commonly used as bankers. We commonly use DCF to, corroborate our thoughts on valuation when we use the other two methods. So it can be a useful element of support for you. But typically, this gets questioned by investors. Either the speed of your growth, the aggression with which you're sort of showing your projections over the next 5 years, 10 years, etc. A discount factor you're using, what is the level of risk you're assuming? All of these things, typically the investor can question. So it's a very contentious sort of method. So we wouldn't recommend anyone to really rely on a DCF, but it's useful to do a DCF to triangulate and actually tell an investor that, I am asking for a certain valuation because I believe I can really drive profitability and cash flows in the future. And that's what I'm asking you to pay for. Just a few guidelines from our side to founders as they think through on valuations for their company and as they have discussions with investors. Please always research, look through available data, public data on precedent transactions. So it's always useful to know who your peers, competitors, etc. are, what sort of field you're operating in, and what deals have happened in that space. So it's also a useful exercise to go through to figure out what investors to target, and it also gives you a benchmark on what to speak when you target those investors, when you have discussions with those investors. So this research can actually throw up data for your precedent transaction analysis, or maybe even for your DCF analysis. It's always useful to have discussions with either your existing investors or new investors in that space, and have a frank discussion with them to ask them, how do they approach valuation? So if they're looking to invest in you, what are the metrics they look at for valuation? So this will give you a sense of what investors look for. And if there are intangible elements of it, so for example, certain investors may tell you, if you get to this many number of users, then I'm a lot more confident that you are a very sustainable sort of a model, and I'll be more happy investing in you, and that makes a big difference to my valuation sort of thesis. So have frank discussions with investors. Always helps if you have good investors on your cap table currently, so you can, they are invested in you and you can sort of have the discussion with them. But definitely it's something which founders should sort of look for. And the third guideline is model exit scenarios for your incoming investors. So many times we feel that founders take a certain approach to valuation, which might look good on paper, but looking at the way companies are growing, does it result in a good exit for the investor at the valuation you are asking for? So if you believe you're worth 100 crore as a company, are you confident of giving the investor whatever, at least a 3x or a 5x sort of return in the next 3 to 5 years? Is that something which works out at a 100 crore entry valuation? So in this case, are you confident of taking the company's valuation to 500 crore? Because in early stage companies, all of these things are relevant, because you don't have operating history, you may not have financial metrics. But every business at some point of time will switch over from these sort of valuation metrics to more traditional financial metrics based valuation. So when is that going to happen for you? And can you, based on your projections, justify to an investor saying that if you do invest at 100 crore, I'm very, very confident of giving you an exit at 500 crore. And I can really paint the picture that you will make 5x on my investment. Right? That's something which is really important to look at. So it's important for founders to have a view on their valuation, especially when they have these discussions with investors. But it's more important also to sort of justify that view and to convince an investor that, I'm thinking out for you as well. Even as you come in, I'm very confident I'll give you the return which you are sort of expecting. So just a few, sort of thoughts on valuation. So coming to deeper into the concept of equity management, it's important to understand your ownership structure and your cap table. So what is a cap table? It's, at a very simple level, most founders look at it as, an Excel which I maintain, which just tells me who holds what in the company. But it's also important to understand that Excel is not created, out of thin air. It's a combination of several transactions which have happened over the history of your company, right from inception. So it's a combination of transactions which results in your cap table looking like what it is today, right? And how is what is the concept of fully diluted stake? So in most investment cases, investors are going to be coming into your company not as equity shareholders or investing in common equity. They're going to be putting money into convertible instruments. So if that's the case, then fully diluted shareholding, the concept basically means that whatever convertible instruments are there on my cap table today, I assume that they convert on some basis. And I present everyone's stake on a common basis, assuming that everybody has converted into equity shares. Because the way, let's say, a founder should understand a cap table should always be on a fully diluted basis. But if you speak to, let's say, a chartered accountant or a company secretary, they might present a cap table differently. They may actually present it across different securities and say that, okay, these are all different securities, and I can't really mix all of this in some sense. But this is a common base on which to sort of analyze your cap table in some sense. So looking at investment structures, what sort of securities can you expect to find on your cap table, and what sort of securities investors typically invest in? There are several choices available based on regulation, based on investment practices, commonly accepted practices. So equity versus preference, right? So as a founder, you will hold equity shares. Maybe your angel investors, some angel investors, your friends, family may also choose to invest in equity shares. But once you start dealing with larger investors, and even today, even from an angel round onward, most investors want to invest in preference shares. So the reason why this is happening is that most investors ask for certain rights superior to the rights which an equity shareholder holds. And I'll cover some of those rights in a later slide. But to give them those rights, it's required for them to hold a different class of security. Because under the Companies Act in India today, you can't have superior rights given to a certain section of your equity shareholders. All of the equity shareholders have to be treated the same. So this is the reason why most investors, prefer to invest in preference shares. Convertible versus redeemable. So in most cases, the most commonly used investment structure is what is called a CCPS, a compulsorily convertible preference share. Preference share for the reason which I explained earlier. And convertible because ultimately you are raising equity from a certain investor. So while he is investing in a security called a preference share because he wants rights, ultimately he's looking at it as an equity investment. He wants to hold a certain stake in your company and he wants to take the equity risk with you. That's the reason why in most cases it's convertible. There's also another reason why it has to be compulsorily convertible, especially when you raise foreign funding. So the regulations are very different for raising equity from international entities versus raising debt from international entities. It is a lot easier to raise equity from international, international funds and foreign sort of investors. That comes in the ambit of FDI. So other than a few sectors, in most sectors, FDI is allowed up to 100% of a company's shareholding. But one needs to justify to the RBI that the money coming in is actually equity and not debt, which is why any foreign investor will come into a compulsorily convertible sort of preference share structure, because he has to justify to the regulator that he doesn't intend to take the money out. He intends to convert it and have it invested, in the company. If he makes it optionally convertible or redeemable, that takes on the character of debt. And if I bring in debt from external sources, that is external commercial borrowing, and that's a far lengthier process, has a lot more regulation, and has restrictions on how you can use the capital, which has been brought in, from outside the country. So that's the reason why, most investors, will invest in, especially international investors, invest in compulsorily convertible securities. Certain other types of securities which are becoming common, which, it might be useful to have a discussion. So the concept of differential voting rights. Here, it's a situation where it's a business which requires a lot of capital, where the founder at some level needs to go below 51%, go below the threshold of raising of controlling a company. But at the same time, he is responsible for running the business. So he may sort of come up with a structure which says that, okay, economic interest in the company, I may be below 51%. I might dilute to other investors because I'm raising capital from them. But I'm still going to give them a security which does not have as much equity rights as my securities, as the securities which I hold. So that I can still hold more than 51% voting interest, even if my economic interest in the company is maybe 20% or 30% or so. So this is a concept that's existed for a long time, but it became fairly popular when Ola started using it, where Bhavish Aggarwal, despite raising capital from SoftBank and despite diluting his stake to a sort of smaller number, he issued differential voting rights to SoftBank and ensured that he controlled the company and he controlled the voting rights in the company. Convertible notes is something again which is becoming very popular, especially for bridge rounds of funding. So where I am between, let's say, a seed round, Series A round, but for whatever reason I might be running short of capital, and I may need to reach out to my existing investors to raise more capital to bridge me until the next round of funding, from either from seed to Series A or Series A to Series B. That form of funding could take the form of a convertible note. So in this structure, an investor basically, you'll typically raise it from existing investors. Your investor basically says that, okay, I'm going to give you capital because you've come to me for a bridge round of funding. I believe in the company. It's probably just a temporary thing that you're out of money. So I'm going to give you capital, but I'm not going to determine a valuation for the capital which I'm giving you. We will make that valuation contingent on the next round of funding. So all of this presupposes that the next round is actually going to happen, and that is a commitment which you as a founder needs to give me as your existing investor, that you will actually carry through the next round within a certain time frame. If I see you slipping on that time frame, or if the time frame gets extended, then I may have the option of asking for my money to be repaid back to me. So it's something which again is quasi debt, which is more common, I would say, among angel investors and domestic investors who can invest in sort of redeemable securities or debt-like securities. And it's also common in DIPP registered startups, where a structure like this is allowed. But it's typically used only for bridge rounds of funding. SAFE agreement, SAFE is one innovation which is being carried through by Y Combinator internationally, and is also coming to India in the way these investments are structured. So it's similar to a convertible note in the sense that you don't specify a valuation for the company. The company is probably very early stage, and there could be a disconnect between the investor and the founder on valuation, where the investor can say that, okay, let's not fight over valuation. I'm going to give you the money, and I'm going to do it fairly quickly without arguing over valuation. Let's make it contingent on the next round of funding. Give me a discount to the next round of funding. So you guys go ahead, raise Series A, but you give me a 25% discount or 30% discount to Series A because I invested earlier. So that way we don't need to argue and establish a valuation at this point of time. The difference between a SAFE and a convertible note is that typically SAFEs are not redeemable. You will sort of, again, similar to a convertible note, you will specify a certain time frame for you to raise funding, but a SAFE agreement will also have a floor valuation to say that if you don't raise funding, then I will convert at a certain, slightly lower sort of valuation. And that's something which, I'm going to sort of do because you have probably failed to raise funding within the typical time frame. Another sort of security which you might see on cap tables are warrants. So typically warrants are issued as an incentive tool for founders to increase their stake in the company. Again, this again is done when you have this, let's say, a dissonance on valuation. So you may want a certain valuation from the investor. Investor wants to come in at a lower valuation, where you can come up to a structure to say that, okay, if you as a founder are able to perform certain milestones, that those could be operating metrics or financial metrics. But if you are able to, over the next 1, 2, 3 years, if you achieve these certain milestones, then I'm happy to sort of give back stake to you as a founder. Effectively meaning that, it's the equivalent of the investor having come in at a higher valuation. And the reason why this is done is, earlier this was being done through ESOPs as well. But since 2013, ESOPs cannot be issued to the founders and the promoters of a company. It's only for the employees of a company. So to bridge that gap, we started doing warrants. So it could be a warrant agreement you sign with your investor, which says that if you achieve certain milestones, you can exercise warrants and increase your stake in the company, where all the other shareholders get diluted. So coming to the rights attached to the securities. I'm not going to cover all investor rights here, but basically rights which affect the stake and your cap table are what is what I'm covering here in some sense. So liquidation preference is a very important right. You will see that in literally all in investment term sheets. So the concept of an LP is that as an investor, I'm a financial investor. I'm relying on you as a founder to run the company. And if if we are sort of going to exit, and if we're going to sell the company for something, I have the right to take my capital out first. So if for whatever reason we come to a situation where the company is being sold, let's say in a distressed sale or whatever, and you're selling the company for less than the capital which I've invested, then I have the right to take out that capital entirely. So you as a founder won't get anything. So this is a very important, sort of right here. People don't think about it. People don't model it a lot because it triggers in scenarios which are not so ideal. It triggers when you're sort of trying to sell the company for a low value or in a distressed sale sort of a thing. But this may even result in a situation where you as a founder may not even get anything. You may actually hold 70-80% stake in a company. But if you're going to sell the company for a low enough value, as a founder, you may get nothing. And the investor, will take his capital out entirely. So there are a few nuances here. When you have multiple rounds of funding, the concept of seniority becomes important. So the investors will have a discussion between themselves to say that, okay, now there are 2-3 of us who have invested. Who gets to take their capital out first? So it's again a negotiated thing. The investors might choose to say that, okay, I'm coming in later and I've come in at a higher valuation. So I have the right to sort of take out my capital first, and then you guys can take your capital out. So that could be one sort of discussion. Or the investors, if they've invested close enough to each other at close enough valuation numbers, they may just choose to say that we'll do it pari passu. Effectively to say that we will all share the gains between ourselves in the ratio of our shareholding. So until we all get our capital back, we will pro rata sort of take the gains from the company. And after we get our capital back, then the founder can sort of take his stake in the company. So that's what seniority sort of means. Typically, liquidation preference is for the capital which is invested, but in early stage funds and VC funds, etc., the discussion may go to say that, okay, it's not enough if I make my capital back, because as a VC, I take a large risk in investing in companies. And I want a multiple of my capital back. I want like 1.5x of my capital or 2x of my capital. So that again is very, very important, because then it puts an even bigger burden on the founder. Your exit needs to be that good to ensure that the investor takes his enhanced capital out, and still there is something left for you as a founder. So that's something to really track to figure out, is the liquidation preference a 1x or a 1.5 or a 2x? It's something which founders also have to sort of check their past shareholder agreements and their future rounds of funding as well. There's a concept of participating liq pref, which again is like a multiplier. It's an enhanced sort of a liquidation preference, which says that the investor says that I take out my capital in full. So if I hold 20% in your company, I'm going to take out my capital out fully. And then for whatever is left, I'm still going to participate to the extent of my stake in the company. So 20% of the balance proceeds also is going to come to me. So in a participating liq pref, the investor always makes more than his capital. And what is very critical for the founder to understand in a participating liq pref, the investor will always take out more than what percentage shareholding he has in the company, just by the operation of mathematics. So if the investor holds 20% stake in a company, at a certain valuation scenario, he might actually take out 30% of the sale proceeds of the company and not 20%. So the larger the valuation is, the lower this gap is going to be. But at lower, exit valuations, you might actually see that the investor actually takes a fairly big chunk of the sale proceeds of the company. So this may not be very apparent, but founders have to sort of watch out for this as they, enter into agreements. Anti-dilution is another clause which is again triggers only in less than desirable scenarios, but has a very profound effect on the shareholding of the founder. So it's important to track anti-dilution. Anti-dilution, the concept basically says that, okay, as an investor, you sold me on a certain vision of your company and you sold me on a certain valuation, and I agreed to that valuation. Now, the implicit understanding, which you and I as a founder investor are going to have is that you will raise further funds at a higher level of valuation so that I'm always in the money. But for whatever reason, if you have to do a down round, if you come and tell me that, I badly have to raise funding and the new investor is giving me a lower valuation, then I want some adjustment in my valuation as well. So that's a concept of anti-dilution. Full ratchet anti-dilution basically says that I don't care how much you're raising from a new investor. If I have come in as, let's say, 100 crore and you're going to raise capital in the next round at 80 crore, you have to make it look as if I have come in at the same 80 crore valuation. So you have to increase my stake to that extent, as if I have come in at 80 crore for 100% of my stake. So that's what full ratchet sort of means, which is, the lower the valuation of the down round, the more impact it has on the shareholding of the founder, and the more you're going to sacrifice as a founder to the investor if a full ratchet is there. This is as compared to what is called a broad-based weighted average anti-dilution, which again is similar to a full ratchet, but is a lot gentler and a lot more forgiving as compared to a full ratchet. So here the investor basically says that, okay, I understand that you may need to raise capital in a down round for an emergency, for something unforeseen. And I also understand that you're going to raise only emergency funding. You're not raising a full round at a lower valuation. So the company may have raised 100 crores of capital in the past, and you may feel the need to do a 5 crore round at a lower valuation. So basically you do the same full ratchet calculation, but you apply a certain a weightage factor to that dilution. You basically say that, okay, the capital which you're raising in the down round, which is 5 crore, say, divided by the total capital which the company has raised so far, 105 crore, 100 crore plus 5 crore. So 5 by 105, I will apply, whatever I'm getting on full dilution, I will do into 5 by 105. And I will sort of increase the investor's stake by that amount. That is the way a weighted average anti-dilution works, just to sort of say that, okay, I'm not going to penalize you a lot in case you're doing this as an emergency measure. Because full ratchet, they don't care how much capital you're raising. You may be doing an emergency sort of fundraise, he will still say you have to reduce my valuation to 80 crore. Whereas weighted average is a lot more forgiving. A few other terms which founders need to watch out for. Most investors say that, if you are giving more favorable terms than me to an incoming investor, then you have to give me those terms as well. So that's something which may not have a financial impact, but that's something which founders need to watch out for. And participative rights. So in all of these other cases, it triggers in a sort of a downside scenario. But participative rights will typically trigger when the company is doing well. So here in this case, the company is doing well. You're going in for the next round of funding. If I take the first one, preemptive right, it's basically the investor saying that, the company is doing well. You are raising the next round of funding. You should give me the option to sort of contribute capital in the next round to maintain my stake. So if I hold 20% stake in the company, you guys are doing a new round. You need to give me 20% of that round at my option, at the investor's option, so that I maintain my stake at 20% in the company. If not, I get diluted. So this is at the option of the investor, but it also means that you need to get approval for your investor and disclose whatever valuation you're sort of raising at in the next round, just to sort of get him to either exercise or not exercise his preemptive. Right of first refusal, right of first offer. ROFO and ROFR is what we typically call it. So this is basically to say that, if you are going out and raising capital and you have a term sheet, then you are required to actually disclose those terms to your existing investor. If he has, let's say, a ROFR, right of first refusal, then even before you allow the new investor to come in, the existing investor has the right to subscribe to the whole round. So it's like an enhanced element of your preemptive right. So typically your ROFR will trigger first, and then the preemptive may sort of trigger. So investor may actually say that, okay, I like the company and the valuation which you're getting is a good enough valuation for me. So I may ask you to send the new investor packing, and I may sort of do the entire round myself. So that's what a ROFR basically sort of means. So what it means for the founder here is that this is typically a very sticky thing when you try to approach the market. So your new set of investors may ask you, do the existing investors have a ROFR? Are they going to participate in this round? And they will typically ask you to get an answer to that question before they evaluate the company, because otherwise the new investor will spend a lot of time and effort in evaluating the company, give you a term sheet, and then have a situation where the existing investor exercises his ROFR and basically does the entire round himself. So all of that evaluation is basically gone to waste. So many times a new investor will say that get in writing from your existing investors that they don't intend to trigger their ROFR, and that they're going to commit a certain sort of portion to this round, or they don't intend to subscribe to the full round. Only then we will sort of begin work on this deal. You may have those conversations with your new investors as well if you have a ROFR clause. A ROFO clause is something similar, where instead of going and getting a term sheet and coming to the existing investor, you have to go and approach the existing investors first and allow him to make an offer to you. So he may make an offer to you at a certain valuation for the amount which you're trying to raise. And if you're not satisfied with that value, you can reject it and you can go out to the market. But you will necessarily need to raise from the market at better terms than what he has offered you. That's a sort of implicit sort of obligation which a founder takes on in a ROFR or a ROFO. So we have talked about investor rights, your cap table, and how to manage your equity. Now coming to the diligence aspect of it, there are several types of diligence that the company goes through before your investment round gets finalized. The most common elements of it are financial and tax and legal diligence. So this will typically happen in most companies, unless it's a very, very sort of early stage company without an operating history, or a company which has not started operations yet. So you will have in a financial diligence, you will have one of your big four accounting firms or any other sort of CA firm come in and look at your records and your financial records primarily over the last 3 years. To sort of not with a view to do an audit, that anyway is something your auditor is doing, but with a view to establish trends and see if the claims you made during prior to the term sheet bear out with the data which is there on the ground. So it's more of, let's say, a trend analysis and asking you to explain how your revenues have moved, how your user metrics have moved, and how your profitability has moved, rather than validating whether the transaction is accurate or not. And tax is again a part of your financial diligence. In a legal diligence, typically a law firm is appointed. They watch out for 2 or 3 things. They go through your legal records. So your ownership records are something which they will go into a lot of detail. So in most diligences, there's a cutoff. People typically review records over the last 3 years or so. But in legal diligence, when it comes to ownership, people review records from the inception of the company, because ownership is a very, very sort of critical aspect of your legal diligence, and these people dig into it a lot more. The other aspect of legal diligence are your contracts, whatever legal contracts you have signed up for. Do they have any onerous clauses? Does the company have any litigation, any instances of non-compliance with existing law? All of that are things which a legal diligence agency will sort of look out for. You may or may not have a technical diligence. This is more suitable for companies or industries which have a high technical component. So let's say a pharma industry, with a company which operates a pharma plant, may have a specialized person come in and review the plant to ensure that compliances, etc., are in place. Or in a hospital, someone can come and sort of do an audit of the hospital building itself and your equipment to ensure that you are following norms. Commercial diligence is something which mostly the investor does, especially in sort of small investments. But in later stages, you may have external agencies do commercial diligence as well. So it can take the form of a market survey. So everyone's the founder and the investor believes that the market size is a certain sort of number. Does it bear out if a person actually does a study on the market? So they may have a person go out and conduct a market study by itself. It could be a customer survey. The customers who are using a certain product, more suitable for B2C companies, what do they sort of have to say about the brand or about the product? That's something which the investor may want to survey. And another aspect, especially for impact-oriented businesses, is how much social impact is the business actually creating. You may have an external agency go out and actually measure that. So a few practices from best practices from a diligence perspective always helps to prepare ahead of time. Our experience in I would say 90% of the clients I've dealt with, diligence as a thought process will start after the founder gets a term sheet. Till that point of time, no one really, sort of puts a lot of thought into it. So after you get a term sheet, you are on the clock to sort of close your deal, to sort of get the funding into the company. And parallelly, you are also trying to do all of these types of diligence or any combination of these types of diligence. It puts a lot of stress on the company, the employees, and the founder himself. And what also happens is that anything which you do during that time frame, you will have the external diligence agency representing the investor sitting on your head and sitting in your office. So your ability to sort of fix issues is also going to be limited. You may not have time, and you may not have the sort of ability to do it before it becomes a problem. This is something which the DD agencies are going to pick up on, and it's most probably going to be part of the report. So even if you do solve the problem, they will say that we found a problem, but the company has solved it. That's the way it's going to come out into the report. So our recommendation to companies is that always think about diligence around the time you start thinking about fundraise itself, and do whatever is sort of required to keep your records clean and records ready from a diligence perspective. The second aspect, it always helps to do a pre-diligence sort of thing, to engage professionals. It could be like smaller law firms or smaller audit firms, to review your records and to point out all the red flags to you even before a full-fledged diligence starts. So it's like a pre-diligence dry run sort of a thing. It's a good rehearsal, and it also gives you enough time to fix any issues which you sort of find during diligence. But overall, the best way to sort of ensure that you have a very smooth diligence process is for you as a company and for you as a founder to ensure that your systems and processes are completely up to spec. Because the best way to sort of handle all these things is to arrest it at a source, to have systems and processes which prevent diligence issues from cropping up, rather than allowing it to crop up and trying to fix it later. So that's that would be our recommendation as well. Even as you are sort of building a company, please build it out with scale in mind, and please try to build it out with the proper ideal systems and processes to ensure that you have control of the company's operations even as it sort of scales up. So Shrikant, over to you, and now we can sort of show you how our product helps in all of these
Sure. No, great. Thanks, Vikram, for setting the context. There's one question. Maybe I'll just quickly address that because maybe I'll kind of avoid the question by not answering it directly, like every valuation question on that gets asked, right? So there is no one answer, Ajit, to that question. We can take it offline. But I have seen deals where where you would when a founder has diluted even at an idea stage, has diluted as low as like say 10% for a significant like 1 year 2 year kind of a runway. And there are deals where where there's a significant value, let's say that stakeholder is adding either as an investor or an operator, and they have taken like 30-40% of the company as well. So this really depends on maybe 3 or 4 parameters, like what the kind of market are you in, also the kind of money you're looking to raise, like what's the kind of runway you're getting with that. And third also is uh, like what's the kind of expectation from what's the value unlocking that is possible for the investor kind of a thing. So we can talk more in detail on a case to case basis to kind of address that question. Okay. But so Vikram basically set the whole context with regard to everything that a founder needs to basically take care of as a readiness point of view. So we are not looking after the typical, like I said, even in the brief, that it's not pitch deck or financial model, which of course are equally important. And I'm sure if you are all in the market raising funds, you would have already done that, right? And if you need more help in that, we can help you offline on that. But we are really looking at aspects which are very important, but not really something that maybe the founders don't prioritize, as Vikram mentioned. And what we have built at Capita, and that is what I'll do next as part of a quick demo, is give you a understanding of how Capita as a product can be a companion to a founder, right? In terms of one, managing a lot of the data in one place. Second is taking care of future scenarios and empowering the founders to understand what those future scenarios mean, and also keeping the company what we call as due diligence ready at all times. Like we said, due diligence and keeping the company due diligence readiness is discipline, and not really something that you kind of clean up your room and somebody is coming to inspect it kind of a thing. So how do we enable you to do that? And that is something that I will very quickly show you. So I'm just sharing my screen, which takes us to the login. So imagine that, and many of you who have joined this webinar are all founders. So you imagine that you're logging into a startup, your startup, right? And we are logging in as an administrator of a particular startup. So Capita is one place where we call it as an equity management one-stop solution, where you can manage your equity ownership or record keeping, right? So as soon as you log in, you see the company, the number of stakeholders. Like this company is it's a fictional company based out of Singapore, and it is let's say it has 20 shareholders on its cap table. It also tells you how many outstanding shares the company has issued on a fully diluted basis, and also the kind of investments this company has raised. So as you see, this company is very fairly well funded, about 63 million Singapore dollars. And that's why you see, you look at the cap table, we show it as at a share class level as a pie chart in the dashboard. So you can actually see, how much of the company is owned by ordinary class shareholders, which is typically the promoters as you incorporate the company. But like Vikram mentioned, as you raise money for your company, you would issue typically preference shares to your investors. So you would have issued different class of shares like seed, Series A, Series B, as you would have heard from startup news. And also equity awards or ESOPs. We are not covering it extensively today, although there were a lot of questions on that. So we can take those questions offline as well. But ESOPs are again a critical component of that ownership of your company, which can be given out to employees and help them unlock value and hence attract them to join your company, even if you might not be paying them, let's say, market standards. Um, you can also see the cap table at a stakeholder level. So who are the top 5 stakeholders? So maybe the promoters are the top, have the highest stake, and then it is kind of spread across other investors. This also gives you a sense that how overall your company is capitalized, right? So how many rounds have you done? What's the dilution at each round? And also how's your company kind of ownership? Is it centralized with a few people, or it is kind of fragmented? What we also have a quick tabular view of the same thing, which I will actually cover when I go to the cap table ownership. Let me do that. So I can actually go to the cap table detailed view. So this is pretty much the Excel files that you maintain, but in a more elegant and a visually appealing format. So you can actually look at all your shareholders of your cap table. You can look at the different class of shares. So here the system can basically take care of all the classes that Vikram alluded to, right? The common stock or common equity, preference shares, which are these green ones, and the convertible notes or convertible instruments like convertible notes, safe instruments, again, that Vikram mentioned, right? And that also is the answer to Ajit's question. Maybe if you're not sure of the valuation, you can actually issue a convertible note where you're not fixing the valuation on any day, right? So all those details are kind of mentioned here. You can also drill down on a particular shareholder and see which are the shares classes, which are the transactions that investor has participated. So and you see this more often and not, that a strategic investor would invest in multiple rounds in the company to maintain that investor's dilution, that investor stake in the company. Right. So in this case, in the fictional company, Sequoia has actually invested serially at seed round, Series A round, Series B round in different time frames. And this is the amount they have invested, and this is the kind of stake that they have accrued, which adds up to the 4.57, right? So imagine you can kind of do this. And very quickly touching upon the in DD readiness part. So what we do is in Capita, and let me just digress a little to transactions. So cap table, like Vikram mentioned, is not something coming out of like suddenly, right? It is actually a historic right from your incorporation, all the transactions that have happened, both primary transactions, secondary transactions, influence or make up your cap table as it is today, right? So on your incorporation date, it's just your promoters or the founders are the shareholders. But when you start making share transfers to, say, another co-founder who joins, or you make issuances to a new investor who's putting in money into the company, right? So these are all influencing your cap tables. So each of these events are actually transactions in your cap table, and this is so the way Capita builds your cap table is actually based on these transactions. So you have to kind of include all the transactions since it's incorporation. There are two broad kinds of transactions: primary transactions, which are issued by the company, like which are share issuances or a convertible note issuances, or secondary transfers, which are between two shareholders, which is what today you go onto the market and trade, right? So that is a secondary transaction where somebody is buying and somebody is selling, right? But the shares are changing hands. So hence the cap table will look different, right? So all events which are transactions which are influencing the cap table will be stored in one place. And not just are the records stored, but also the relevant documents. So for example, now Sequoia invested in this round. So we can actually look at all their documents, say what is the typical, so this is a Singapore company, but it will be the ROC filing. You have to file to the ROC with certain forms like PAS3 and MGT14, etc. to basically onboard that investor and issue shares. You will have signed an SHA agreement with that investor. So that also is kind of saved in one place. You would also have some kind of a board resolution to onboard the investor, or the share certificates you would have issued to the investor, right? So all those documents which today would have been placed somewhere or the other in your SharePoint or Google Drive can actually be contextually tagged to that particular transaction in the system, right? Now advantage of doing this is when you go to the cap table and when I click on Sequoia, right, I can actually get those transactions in one place, right? And so this is what we call as due diligence readiness, because now any new investor who wishes to invest in your company, or any law firm who's willing to do a due diligence on your company, can actually access these in one place, right? So the transaction timelines, we hope, will reduce a lot, because you are able to provide all the information in one place. All you need to do is give that person or that agency access to this platform, and there are no multiple email back and forth or attachments and stale versions of files going to the person, right? All those things are avoided, because as you see, this is a single source of truth, right? This is the view that everyone sees, and this is the current reality, right? But many a times what happens is many investors would have the previous version of your cap table, and it's very difficult to kind of maintain that consistency, and the complexity only increases when you add more and more shareholders to maintain that. So here it's one system where you can give all the access to the investor. Now, coming to a lot of the investor rights and the things that Vikram covered, right? So I'll not, obviously he covered everything about the details. All I want to say here is what we do is we again look to empower the founders to make them understand the implications of those rights, right? So Vikram talked about liquidation preference, right? Now, how does liquidation preference play out? So what we do is when we onboard the cap table, we also onboard all the class level information which are there in your shareholder agreement, right? The shareholder agreement will have the terms of liquidation preference, anti-dilution, etc. So we will capture all those properties in your shareholder agreement, which will have an implication on your cap table or your exit, right, payouts. In one place. So the conversion ratio in case of CCPS, you can convert to a different equity. If you have 100 CCPS, it need not convert to 100 equity. It can convert to different ratios. So we can configure that information. Any dividends and interest which will have a cash implication in the payouts, right? So all those details, anti-dilution is something we are about to add, right? So when we do configure all of this information, what we enable founders to do is run scenarios. And this is where we really empower the founders, right? So if you maintain your cap table in an orderly way, you can perform several scenarios, like one, what we call as waterfall, which is for an exit event, right? So let's say this company is raised about 60 million. Let's say it is getting an exit at about 125 million Singapore dollars, right? And you can also configure certain debt or loan on the books. Let's say there's $25 million of loan. Now you can also have an exit date which will determine the IRR of the transaction. So if I say this is an event, so let's say somebody has put an acquisition value for this amount. And when I do a perform analysis, it will go through all the configurations which I just showed you as part of the liquidation preference or anti-dilution and all of that, and give a very elegant view to the founder to say at what valuation or at what exit value, how much is each stakeholder making. So in this case, at 125 million, you see that John Tan is making 13.3 million, etc. Right? So what it does, it goes through all the logic that is there in SHA, and makes it very easy for founders to run different scenarios. You can also view the same view by share class, where you can actually first, it's more intuitive to understand that first the debt gets paid out. So if tomorrow only 25 million is what you unlock, then no investor gets any money, because you have to pay out the debt, which is always senior to equity. But once you have more than 25 million, the senior most class, which is what Vikram mentioned, the last investor actually takes away most of the rights, right? So here you'll see the last investor is actually taking up most value, and only after you hit say 80 million exit value is when the other investors will start making money, and also the equity holder, the ordinary shareholders, will also start making money, right? So these are all kind of possibilities that the platform allows founders to do. You can also save the scenario. So I just ran this scenario. So your investors will have access to the same scenario. So you can actually discuss these with your advisors, mentors, investors, and have more informed discussions on actual, scenarios rather than, hypothesizing on something that you don't understand. We also are building something called finance round. This is very relevant for a lot of you because you're raising the next round of capital. So what does it mean for your cap table? Let's say you raise a bridge round. What does it mean? If you raise a full-fledged Series A round, what does it mean, right? How much are you diluting? What is the approach you have to take? So what this feature gives you is it will take the current cap table and it will give you what will your cap table look like if this investment were to go through. So the variables are basically what's the investment amount, what's the valuation that investor is coming in, and etc etc. And with that we can give you what we call as the pro forma cap table of the next round, which with which you can do a comparison with. If you say have two term sheets from two investors, you can take a more conscious or calculated decision. Again, consult with your existing mentors or existing investors to take the right decision, right? And last, we also have the return analysis, which is the opposite of waterfall, where here you give an exit value of acquisition. Here in return analysis, you give an estimated return in IRR terms or return multiple terms. So that, and also a time frame. So what this enables is it will tell the founder, it will empower the founder to know what is the expectation this investor might have with regard to an exit. And will I be even able to cater to that expectation, so that again founders can look to enter into transactions which they believe is in the interest of all the parties, right? So these are something like the idea is to take away all that complex formulae and Excel files which maybe is very difficult to maintain and operate, to something which is very user friendly and very elegant in the outputs that the founder gets, right? So these are all things that the platform enables you to do. You can also kind of look at the cap table at a ownership level and a security class. So you can see who are my seed investors, who are my Series A investors, and again access the same level of details that I just showed you, right? And also access all the documents. Let's say all the documents like I showed you in Sequoia's case, etc. So that's about the transactions. Very critically, how to manage the users, right? And stakeholders and users. So stakeholders are the shareholders on your cap table, and users are representing the stakeholders to who log into the platform and access it. So obviously, shareholding information is private information. It is it is only to be shared with people who is supposed to know that information. So we have this is a secure cloud platform where founders can enable that. So you can actually uh, kind of have different roles for which you can share this access to your cap table. Let's say your investor, employee, advisor, administrator is typically the founder himself, and there you can have different level of access as well. So an employee will only get to see an individual level view, while an investor might get a detailed view, while maybe early stage investors or angel investors might get summary view. So you can configure that view. In detailed view, you'll get a line by line item of all the shareholders, while in summary view, you can aggregate that and not disclose the names of the shareholders. So all those possibilities are there. The thumb rule basically is the founder will decide who gets to see your cap table and no one else, right? So it's not a public information in that sense, right? Finally, there is a big module for ESOPs. We have an end-to-end module for managing employee stock options, which are ESOPs, which are very critical for attracting the right talent into your company. This is not strictly to the topic, but I know that a lot of you have asked questions on that. So to them, right from creating your ESOP, right, creating a ESOP award plan in your company, to managing it, so viewing, maintaining all, you can have multiple pools in your company, to granting the awards when new employee joins. How do I kind of have the vesting schedule where I know they can vest the ESOPs over a period of time, so that you also incentivize them to stay longer into your company, etc. And finally, managing it in a dashboard like this, where you can see which are the active employees having ESOPs, which are the ones who have left your company, how much have they been awarded, how much have they invested, how much is unvested, and also kind of view all the documents in one place, their vesting schedules, and also the ESOP letters, right, which is given to the employee. So we are creating a completely digital platform, completely paperless, and also linking it to digital signature. So you don't have to step out of the platform to manage ESOPs. And maybe we'll take a few questions on how to carve out ESOPs maybe towards the end, right? So I'll pause the demo here, and there are just a couple of slides, that I would like to end with, and then we can kind of open up for questions. Uh, so finally, this is something which we are building towards. As I mentioned that what we represent the data on the platform in terms of transactions, and because we know what kind of a transaction is it a primary issuance, it's a share transfer, and within primary issuance, is it a private placement or a rights issue? Based on that, we will have the ability to understand what are the relevant compliances that a founder or the company needed to take care of, and basis that we can actually give you a score as to did you even comply by it, and do you have there were 10 documents prescribed for a preferred share issuance. Do you have those 10 documents, right? And if you don't have, we can actually alert the founder that, hey, there are these documents missing, maybe you've not uploaded them to the platform, or you have not complied by that process. And if either way, you will have to take care of that, so that these things don't come up as a red flag in the future, but the founders are more proactively alerted about these. So we have an investment readiness index that we are soon building, and based on the completeness of your data on a platform like ours, we'll be able to alert the founders much in advance that, are you even ready? What are the gaps that you have, right? And highlight those gaps. So something like ROC filings are missing, or shared certificate names are different or are missing, right? Or let's say the data is mismatching between the shareholder agreement and the share certificate, right? So all those data can be highlighted, so help founders become what we call as DD ready all times, and avoid any red flags kind of in the future, kind of a thing. So a couple of slides to close the discussion today and open up for questions. So one is, Vikram talked a lot about the compliance and instruments and equity part, right? It's also very important as founders for you, and there were also a few questions in the registration form with regard to the source of capital, right? So see, equity is obviously one of the sources available at the disposal of the funders, and we are living in great times today where there are investors of all kinds actually flocking to India to give money to invest to startups, right? But the founders also need to understand that they can actually diversify their source of capital. This is what is called as the typical capital spectrum, right? So there are three broad forms where you can raise capital. So one is grant, which and debt, which are non-dilutive forms of capital, where it's not diluting your shareholding, and equity, of course, is a dilutive form of funding. Of course, if there's an option of grant and no non-grant, the option should be grant, right? Because it's like free money in that sense. There are a lot of stakeholders who give various kind of grants for based on the kind of sector the company. So if you're a life sciences company, there are BIRAC grants like BIG, SIBRI, BIPP, Sparsh. There are grants by Millennium Alliance run by FICCI, and there's India Innovation Growth Program. A lot of governments like Maharashtra State, I mean Startup Week, MSINS, they actually give out work orders, right? That's also as in form of a grant. So it's good money in the early days of the company. Elevate, Karnataka government also gives out about 50 lakhs to about 100 startups every year. So these are all different schemes. This is not a holistic list. All of this, there are like perhaps 100 more of those options available to you. So if you need more, you can always reach out to us, but there's enough information in the ecosystem if you explore. So definitely explore grants, and typically use grants for things like R&D, innovation, prototype development, validation, pilots, right? In some cases, market access, wherever it's an impact kind of a setting where your customer might not be the user, right? So definitely use grants in areas which are belong to these, which typically are not funded by other forms of capital, right? But once you have proven that this is a model that will work, and there's attractiveness for the investor, that's when you can go into either equity or debt. Equity again is something, it's like a catch-all, right? I mean, if you can't, so I'll cover debt first, right? So debt is something that there's a returnability there. I mean, there's an obligation in equity, although the investors are seeking much more returns, but there's no obligation from the for the founder or the startup to return the money. It is like they're a shareholder. If you make money, they'll make money. But in debt, it is different. They can act, there's an obligation to pay back, right? So you need to be very careful in exploring debt. You should look for debt only for returnable forms of capital, like something like a working capital, where you know that the money is definitely coming in the next 2 months, 3 months, right? Receivables, same thing, right? Or project finance, where you know for sure that this project will yield returns in 5 years. So let me go for like a 5 crore project finance. And there are banks that do it kind of a thing, right? So debt can go into very specific causes, and that cash flow predictability should be there in the nature of that, evaluation. In equity, it's like everything else, right? After you're grant funded to some extent, and you know exactly that it's quite attractive and people are willing to underwrite value to you, is where you go for equity, where you can use that for pretty much everything, right? Hiring your core team, spending on sales, marketing, expansion. You see most of the e-commerce companies for 10, 12 years, they have only burnt money of equity to acquire customers and build a market share, right? And maybe now they will start monetizing, right? So equity has gone actually pretty much to fund a lot of those startups. In fact, debt is very hard, although there are a lot of government schemes, but we have also seen that startups have not been able to explore that quite a bit, right? Um, and within equity, and then for various stages, explore different kinds of capital. So right in the early stage, like I said, grants. You can look at in the lab to prototype stage or in pre-MVP stage, you should look at bootstrapping or raising money from friends and family. Of course, there are those investors who also operate there, but very few. But when you are at a prototype stage, you can always explore incubators, angel investors, etc. And when you go to market and growth stage, you can typically explore the venture capital or PE eventually at the later stage. And at the growth stage also, when cash flows become more and more predictable, you can explore debt, right? And these are some, indicative list, again, more keeping an impact mindset there. But if anyone is looking to raise funds and need a list of investors they can approach, we can look at the sector you are in and the stage and recommend other investors as a follow-up to this. Okay. So finally, yeah, I mean, I just wanted to take a pause and yeah, feel free to kind of, ask any questions. Just the last couple of slides. So one is what investors look for, and this is the question we got. So very simple answer to that is, see, investors are looking for a story from you, right? This is a laundry list of things they might look at, right? But unfortunately, you can't sandwich all of this into one deck or one presentation. They want to listen to a story from you, whether that story is saying that are you building something incredible and big and novel, right? And you can use a permutation and combination of these bullet points to say which of these will represent your story the best. And hence pitch fundraising and pitching is actually a very creative exercise. It's a storytelling exercise, right? So are you able to show what are you able to navigate through that 35,000 feet and 0 feet view, saying you understand the problem very well because you have been closer to the users, but you also understand the larger market opportunity because it's such a big problem to be solved, right? So do you have that vision, as well as do you have that nuance of that problem itself that you're willing to solve? I'll not go into each of them, but your business, your team, your traction, the future plans, very important. What's your kind of model for 5-year growth? What is your 2-year status, and what is your 5-year vision, right? Both should be apparent to the investor so that they know that 2-year, this is what you need. And if somebody doesn't fund you, then you will be out of money. And 5-year is this is what you wish to achieve if your plans go through right? So this is where your go-to market strategy comes. How will you target your market? That clarity of, thought to the investor, right? And they'll also look for proxies if you have won awards and all, but as and when you grow, those things become irrelevant because finally the metrics that you operate matters the most. And finally, your detailed financial model, again, something that you would have done already, and your kind of cap table and all that information that we showed you earlier as well, right? So these are something that we look for, and we also have some things to offer you guys. So one is we have a freemium product. So especially for MSNs, we also have another offer. If you come through this, that if you're not raised capital less than 1 million, that is about 7 crores. Our product is free today, so you can subscribe to our product, and only after you start having beyond that, you'll pay a nominal subscription. Right now the price is about $0.5 per user per stakeholder per month, and then we also have the complimentary investment readiness score is something I showed you, so we can kind of work get that for you for your startup. We can onboard you. We also have an ESOP plan, and we can take a few questions also on that. And of course, we are always open to kind of engaging with founders and helping them solve their problems of fundraising. And also, we kind of give our access to our platform where they can. A lot of these can be managed by the founders themselves, right? So I'll kind of take a pause here. These are our coordinates, so feel free to reach out to us at any point. And yeah, so let's open up for questions feel free to,
I think
ask
one
more.
question from Ajit on, in the event you don't have an operating history, what will an investor look for? So I'll just give my brief thoughts on that. So broadly, the investor, what will he sort of negotiate on is just his assessment of how good the opportunity is, the
Right.
investable quotient, the way I sort of covered it, and he will try to sort of put a value to it. Broadly, as a thumb rule, you have a conversation with, let's say, an angel network or a set of angels. Typically, they would like to hold somewhere between, anywhere from 20 to 33% of a company for the capital they're investing. I mean, there's no logic to this number. They just feel that, okay, in an angel round, I want to hold a reasonable chunk of the company, but I don't want to hold too much of the company, which will make fundraise difficult for the founder in the future.
Yes.
So if the founder dilutes too much, let's say you get to like 40%, 45% in your seed round itself, even before you've started the company, and then you want to raise capital, then someone comes and says that, okay, this is pushing you below 51%, so I'm not too comfortable. So the angel investors also know that, which is why they don't want to, stress out the founder as well and make the company overall less investable by taking up too much equity. At the same time, they want a reasonable quantum of equity. Now, whether it's going to be 20% or let's say 30%, that range depends on how strong you're able to, sort of put your story forward to him, how convincingly you're able to tell him. So, from an angel investor's perspective, if I'm an angel investor, I know that I've hit a home run in you when you go for the next round of funding. So if I invest in a company and that company goes for a Series A round of funding, I know that I've comfortably made 5 to 6x. And over a period of time, I can actually make like a 10x return in the company. So can you convince the investor that, you have what it takes to push this to the next round of funding? And you as founder and the business itself is attractive enough, and you know what you're sort of doing in the business, and you are completely confident of taking it to Series A. If that is a case you can make, then you can actually argue for a lower stake. You can actually say that, okay, I can do all these things, and I think you should recognize the sort of quality of the founding team and give us a higher valuation, thereby take a lower stake. So, but typically we have seen it swing between this whole 20 to 30 to 33%, sort of time frame.
Right. So there, yeah, so I see that, and maybe Ajit, we can definitely take this conversation offline. There is one question on equity. So this is a very interesting question by YM. I don't know the full name, but what is the equity that you need to give to an incoming founder, which means that you are actually onboarding a new co-founder eventually, right? I mean, over a course of time. So actually, this again becomes a function of at what stage are you onboarding the co-founder, right? If you incorporated the company yesterday and you're in onboarding today, maybe the co-founder ideally would have a comparable stake, right? Because it's and I'm here assuming that the co-founders are similar in their competence, right? I mean, in terms of the value that they are bringing into the startup, either as a business person or a technical person. And typically, you'll see that shareholdings are typically comparable between co-founders. But say once you have brought a product or you have done some traction, you have got a validation, right? Then the equation changes, right? So I have also seen startups where the discussion on co-founder equity becomes comes down to, let's say, a single digit equity as well, right? Because once the startup the product is in the market, or they're already making revenue and they're bringing a co-founder, then there are various ways in which over a period of time you have equity being transferred, like Vikram talked about warrants. So use warrants or those mechanisms where you transfer equity. So there you'll start seeing what is the overall value the company has and what will gain over a period of next 5 years, and what is the value is reasonable for offering to the co-founder, looking at the opportunity cost of the co-founder, right? So I have seen examples where a co-founder is also getting very single digit equity, also like a low single digit equity, like 5%, 8% also at a later stage, right? So and there are also, like, once the company is maybe IPO and all, you also see have co-founders who might be even get lesser, but in terms of overall value, they're actually getting a lot of value, right? So these are all the possibilities exist for that question. um, I hope that answers your question. Otherwise, we can kind of follow up. So Vijay, your question about portfolio management. So one is this is only for startups and private companies, Vijay. But the other thing, I'll quickly show you something that might be interesting for you is we also have ways. If you are a shareholder in multiple cap tables, multiple startups, then yes, you can manage a portfolio. So let's say I'm logging in as an investor. So what I can do is I can look at all my portfolio funds, and I can access all my startups of my portfolio in one one view, right? So this is ideal for an angel investor or a fund who have shares in multiple startups, and they can then access that startup's cap table. They'll see what is their stake in that company and all the other shareholders based on the level of access they have in that company, right? So that is a possibility is there. This is typically for funds and portfolio managers of startups. Of course, we are not looking at other asset classes like equity or real estate or all of that. So I hope that answers your question, Vijay. Any other questions? I know there were a few questions on ESOPs in the form, so let us know if somebody in this requires more aspects about how to create ESOP pools and all of that, and we can also take it offline. And also about, I did cover things about what makes your investability and what does investor look for. If there are any follow-up questions on that, we can take that as well. Just pause for a couple of minutes. I'll also bring up our contact details if you wish to reach to us, and we're very happy to explore if we can help you in your journey with our product, and also any other kind of guidance you would need in your capital raising process. Great. Yeah, we'll just wait for a minute, and we can, if there are no questions, we can sign off. With regard to confidentiality, yes, Vijay. So this is on the cloud. Like I said, there are two levels of aspects here. So one is a technical aspect. So like pretty much any other data that you put on your cloud, be it your Google Drive or let's say a QuickBooks, etc. This is a secure cloud platform with security features like relevant encryption and all of that. Second level is the operational level security, right? So like I said. It's completely the founders or the decision on whom this data can be shared towards. This is not a open public platform like Traction or Crunchbase where you can just go and check for equity which they would have gathered from secondary sources. This is actually founder is putting in all the data, and the founder only can share it with whomever the founder desires. So that is the way we go about it. Okay, perfect. Thanks. Okay, yeah, thank you. We also enjoyed this, and yes, so Gulzar, you just need to drop us an email. I'll also follow up with the details on email for all the registrants. So you can just respond to that, and we can get started, get on a quick call, and figure out how to onboard you guys. Okay, great. Devendra, over to you. We enjoyed the interaction. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Shrikant. Thanks, Ikram. Quite informative session. I also enjoyed learning a lot. I hope the participants also enjoyed. I thank you again, Capita, to host this session for us for the ecosystem, and we'll keep on doing this session. So do check out our Twitter and email list, and also follow Capita for their updates. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for
Yes,
participating.
thank you. Yeah, we
Thanks a
are
lot.
also a
Thanks,
young
everyone.
startup like many of you, and require your support and your feedback mainly to make our product better. So yes, we are also in the same boat in some sense. So yeah, let's navigate that together. Thanks a lot, Dev and Mithun and everyone from MS team. It has always been a fruitful partnership, and we hope to continue that with Capita as well.
Thanks, guys. Bye
Thank
bye.
you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.